Sometimes the loneliest nights bring the greatest purpose. On Christmas Eve in the village of Vintergard, a giant Viking warrior named Brandr sat alone by his fire, carrying the weight of his violent past. When a desperate knock came at his door, he found a young woman collapsed in the snow, fleeing from raiders who had destroyed her life. Without hesitation, Brandr took her in and made a choice that would change everything. He rode alone to face the raiders who had terrorized her. What happened next shocked the entire village and proved that even the most feared warrior can find redemption. But what price did Brandr pay for this woman's freedom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the fjords of Vintergard like the voices of ancient spirits, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter that would test even the strongest souls. In the distance, warm light flickered from the windows of the village longhouses, where families gathered around their hearths for the sacred Yule feast. The scent of roasted meat and mulled ale drifted on the cold air, mingling with the smoke from a dozen chimneys that painted grey ribbons against the star-filled sky. But beyond the village proper, where the forest met the rocky coastline, stood a solitary dwelling that remained dark, save for a single flame dancing in its central hearth. This was the home of Brandr Ironwill, and tonight, like so many nights before, he sat alone with only his memories for company. The longhouse bore the marks of a warrior's dwelling, functional, sparse, built for strength rather than comfort. Weapons lined the walls in careful arrangement, swords with worn leather grips, spears with iron points dulled by use, and shields bearing the scars of countless battles. Above the stone hearth hung a massive war axe, its blade still stained with the rust-brown remnants of blood that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. This was Skull Splitter, the weapon that had earned Brandr his fearsome reputation, and ultimately led to his exile from the very village whose lights now twinkled in the distance. Brandr himself was a man who commanded attention without seeking it. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders filled the space around him like a mountain fills a valley. His beard, once golden like wheat in summer, had begun to show threads of silver that spoke of battles fought and years lived hard. Scars crisscrossed his massive arms, some from enemy blades, others from the claws of bears he had wrestled in his youth. But it was his eyes that told the truest story. Pale blue like winter eyes, they held depths of sorrow that no amount of ale could drown. 3 winters had passed since the incident at Ravenskull Bay. 3 winters since Brandr had allowed his berserker rage to consume him so completely that even his own kinsman had turned away in horror. The memories still burned in his mind like a fresh wound. The way the enemy had fallen beneath his axe, not as warriors seeking glory, but as men begging for mercy he could no longer hear through the roar of battle fury. When the red mist finally cleared from his vision, he found himself standing knee-deep in a sea of the dead, his weapon heavy with the weight of souls sent too soon to Valhalla. The village elders had not banished him with harsh words or ceremonial judgment. They had simply looked upon what he had become, this creature of pure violence who could no longer distinguish between enemy and innocent, and asked him to leave. For the safety of all, they said. For his own peace, they whispered. And Brandr, recognizing the monster he had become, had gathered his possessions and built his home where his rage could harm no one but himself. Now he lived as a ghost on the edges of the community that had once celebrated his victories. The villagers spoke of him in hushed tones, parents using his name to frighten children into obedience. Behave, or Brandr Ironwill will come for you in the night, they would say. Never knowing that the man they feared spent his evenings carving wooden toys for children he would never meet, or that he left anonymous gifts of meat from his hunting at the doors of widows struggling through the winter months. The irony was not lost on him. He who had been born to protect had become the thing from which others needed protection. He who had once stood as a shield between his people and their enemies now sat alone, watching their celebrations from afar like a wolf observing a flock he dared not approach. Tonight was particularly difficult. Yule was a time for family, for sharing stories and strengthening bonds between kinfolk. It was when warriors returned from distant raids to embrace wives and children, when grandparents passed down the ancient tales to wide-eyed youngsters, when the community came together to honor their ancestors and pray for favorable seasons ahead. For Brandr, it was simply another reminder of all he had lost in his pursuit of glory. He poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks dancing up toward the smoke-blackened rafters. The flames cast moving shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of life in a space that felt increasingly like a tomb. On the table beside him lay an untouched plate of bread and dried fish, his attempt at celebrating the sacred night. But food had little flavor when eaten alone, and even less when seasoned with regret. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the wooden shutters and sending snow devils spinning across the cleared ground around his longhouse. Brandr pulled his woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders and tried to find warmth in memories that seemed to grow colder with each passing year. He thought of his father, Magnus the Bold, who had taught him to swing his first sword and shared the old stories of their ancestors' great deeds. He remembered his mother's gentle hands bandaging his childhood scrapes while humming ancient lullabies. Both now lay beneath stone markers in the village cemetery, their graves tended by relatives who would cross to the other side of the path rather than acknowledge their wayward son. Lost in these melancholy thoughts, Brandr almost missed the sound when it came. 3 soft knocks against his wooden door, so faint they might have been mistaken for branches tapping against the walls. He lifted his head, listening carefully, wondering if the wind had played tricks with his hearing. The knocks came again, more insistent now, and with them a voice so weak it seemed to drift on the winter air itself. "Please," came the whispered word, barely audible above the storm. "Help me." Brandr rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to moving quickly despite his size. His hand instinctively moved toward the sayax at his belt, old habits dying hard even in isolation. But as he reached for the door's wooden latch, something in that voice, a quality of desperation so pure it cut through his warrior's caution, made him pause. This was not the voice of an enemy seeking to catch him off guard. This was someone in genuine need. He lifted the heavy bar that secured his door and pulled it open, winter rushing in to greet him with icy fingers. What he saw in his doorway made his breath catch in his throat and his heart skip against his ribs like a stone across still water. A young woman knelt in the snow, her body curled forward, as if she were praying to gods who had forgotten her name. Her hair, dark as a raven's wing, hung in tangled strands around her face, partially obscuring features that even in distress showed the kind of beauty that poets wrote songs about. Her dress, once perhaps blue or green, was now torn and stained with mud and worse things. Frost clung to the fabric like a second skin, and her bare feet were blue-white with cold that spoke of a desperate journey through conditions no person should endure. But it was what she clutched in her trembling hands that made Brandr's warrior instincts flare to life. A silver pendant, its chain broken, gleamed in the firelight from his hearth. Even from where he stood, he could make out the intricate carving of ravens in flight, the symbol of the Shadowbeak clan, a peaceful fishing community that lived 2 days' hard ride to the north. And if this woman bore their mark, if she had travelled so far in such condition, then something terrible had happened in the lands beyond Vintergard's protective embrace. Without hesitation, Brandr stepped into the snow and gathered the woman into his arms. She was light as a bird, her body radiating cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. As he lifted her, she stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to reveal irises the color of summer seas. For a moment, their gazes met, and he saw in them a fear so profound it made his own demons seem small by comparison. "You are safe," he said in a voice that had once commanded warriors in battle, but now carried only gentle reassurance. "I will not let anyone harm you." She tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly before she managed a single word. "Raiders." Then her eyes closed again, and her body went limp in his arms, as consciousness fled from the overwhelming relief of finally finding sanctuary. Brandr carried her into his longhouse and laid her carefully on his own sleeping furs near the fire. He moved with surprising delicacy for such a large man, adjusting her position to ensure she could breathe easily while still benefiting from the hearth's warmth. Then he set about the familiar tasks of tending to the wounded, skills learned in countless campaign seasons, when caring for injured comrades meant the difference between an army and a funeral pyre. He heated water in his largest pot and gathered clean cloth, honey for wounds, and strong ale for when she awakened. As he worked, his eyes kept returning to the silver pendant, still clutched in her frozen fingers. The Shadowbeak clan had been allies to Vintergard for generations, their fishermen providing fresh catch in exchange for protection from the more aggressive tribes that sometimes raided the coast. If raiders had struck their settlement, it meant the careful balance of power in the region had shifted, and not for the better. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, his focus remained on the fragile life he had brought into his sanctuary. As Brandr gently cleaned the mud and blood from her feet and hands, he found himself remembering his mother's gentle touch and his father's lessons about the duty warriors owed to those who could not protect themselves. For the first time in 3 years, he felt the stirring of purpose beyond mere survival. The woman, for he had begun thinking of her as more than just a stranger, murmured in her unconscious state, words too soft to understand, but carrying the unmistakable tone of remembered terror. Brandr found himself speaking to her in low, comforting tones, the way his mother had once soothed him through childhood nightmares. He told her about the safety of his longhouse, about the warmth of his fire, about how the dawn would bring new hope and the promise of protection. Outside, the wind continued its wild dance, but within the walls of Brandr's home, a different kind of storm was beginning to brew. For in rescuing this mysterious woman, he had taken the first step on a path that would either lead to his redemption or his destruction. And as he settled into his chair to keep watch through the longest night of the year, Brandr Ironwill allowed himself to hope that perhaps the gods had not abandoned him after all. Dawn came slowly to Vintergard, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Brandr had not slept, choosing instead to maintain his vigil beside the hearth, where the mysterious woman lay wrapped in his finest furs. Throughout the night, she had stirred fitfully, sometimes crying out in words he could not understand, other times whimpering like a wounded animal caught in a trap. Each sound had tightened something in his chest, a protective instinct he thought his exile had killed. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the wooden shutters, she finally opened her eyes. They were the color of deep water, Brandr noted. but clouded now with confusion and lingering fear. She attempted to sit up, then winced as her body reminded her of the ordeal she had endured. "Easy," Brandr said, his voice gentle despite its natural depth. "You are safe here. No one will harm you under my roof." She studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read men's intentions in their eyes. What she saw there must have reassured her, for some of the tension left her shoulders. "You are Brandr Ironwill," she said, her voice still hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "The exiled berserker." The words hit him like a physical blow, though he showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. "I am Brandr. Yes. But I am no longer the man those stories describe." He gestured toward a wooden bowl filled with warm broth. "You need to eat. Your body has endured much." She accepted the bowl gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. The warm liquid seemed to restore some color to her pale cheeks. "My name is Thora Ravensmark, daughter of Jarl Eriksson of the Shadowbeak clan." She paused, her eyes growing distant. "Or I was, before they came." Brandr settled back in his chair, giving her space while remaining close enough to offer comfort if needed. "Tell me what happened, when you are ready. But know that you owe me no explanations. You may stay here as long as you need." Thora's hand moved instinctively to her throat, seeking the comfort of a pendant that was no longer there. Brandr quietly retrieved the silver ravens from where it had fallen and held it out to her. Her eyes filled with tears as she took it, cradling the broken chain like a precious child. "My grandmother gave this to me," she whispered. "It has been in our family for 7 generations, passed from mother to daughter. She said the ravens would always guide me home." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "But there is no home to return to now." She drank more of the broth, gathering her strength along with her courage. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of horrors witnessed. "They came 3 days ago, just after sunset. Black ships with red sails, carrying men who fought like demons. We thought we were prepared. Our warriors had trained for raids. Our watchers were posted. But these were not ordinary raiders seeking silver or thralls." Brandr leaned forward slightly, his warrior's mind already analyzing the tactical implications. "How many ships?" 5 that I counted, each carrying perhaps 30 men. But it was not their numbers that made them so terrible. It was their leader. Thora's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The villagers called him Bloodfang, and he wore the pelt of a white bear over mail so dark it seemed to swallow light. When he spoke, even his own men trembled." The name struck Brandr like a sword thrust to the gut. Bloodfang the Cruel was legendary among the northern raiders, a man who had earned his reputation through acts so vicious that even hardened Vikings crossed themselves when speaking his name. If he had turned his attention to the peaceful settlements around Vintergard, then the danger was far greater than a simple raid for plunder. "He gathered all the villagers in the center of our settlement," Thora continued, her knuckles white as she gripped the bowl. "The children, the elders, everyone." Then he began asking questions about something called the Frostborn blade. Brandr's blood turned to ice. The Frostborn blade was more than legend. It was a weapon forged in the early days of the world, when the gods still walked among mortals. Said to be imbued with the power of winter itself, the blade could freeze a man's blood in his veins or bring eternal winter to an entire kingdom. Most dismissed it as a tale told around winter fires. But if Bloodfang believed it was real and thought he could find it in these lands— "My father told Bloodfang we knew nothing of ancient weapons." Thora's voice cracked. "He said our clan had always been fishermen and traders, that we dealt in nets and silver, not swords and sorcery. But Bloodfang did not believe him. She set the bowl aside, her hands shaking too badly to hold it steady. He began killing people, one by one, demanding answers none of us possessed. My father, my brothers, my cousins, they all died trying to protect information we never had. And when the slaughter was done, and Bloodfang realized the truth, he burned our village to hide his mistake. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks now, but her voice grew stronger with each word, as if sharing the burden lightened its weight. I only escaped because my grandmother pushed me into the cold cellar where we stored the winter fish. I hid there while my world burned above me, listening to the screams of my family and the laughter of their killers. When I finally emerged, there was nothing left but ash and corpses. Brandr rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside her, his massive frame somehow conveying comfort rather than threat. You survived because you were meant to survive. Your family's sacrifice was not in vain if it preserved your life. But why did I live when they died? What purpose is there in being the last of my line? The anguish in her voice cut through Brandr's carefully maintained emotional barriers like an axe through ice. That is a question only time can answer, he replied gently. But I swear to you by my father's grave and my mother's memory, you will not face this alone. For the first time since awakening, Thora looked directly into his eyes. What she saw there, the depth of understanding, the shared knowledge of loss, the genuine desire to protect, made her breath catch. This was not the monster from the stories, the berserker who had lost himself in blood and rage. This was a man who had found his way back to honor through pain that matched her own. The villagers say you are dangerous, she said softly. I was, Brandr admitted, without flinching from the truth. But that man died in exile, just as surely as your family died in flames. What remains is someone who has learned the difference between strength and violence, between protection and destruction. Outside, the sounds of the village awakening drifted through the walls. Children's laughter, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, the low voices of men planning their daily work. Normal sounds of normal lives, untouched by the horror that had consumed the Shadowbeak settlement. But for how much longer? Bloodfang will not stop with one village, Brandr said, his mind already working through the implications. If he truly seeks the Frostborn blade, he will tear apart every settlement between here and the Great Ice until he finds it or convinces himself it does not exist. And if the legends are true about its power, you believe the blade is real? Thora asked. Brandr was quiet for a long moment, weighing truth against hope, knowledge against comfort. My grandfather once told me stories of the old times, when the world was younger and magic flowed like water through the land. He spoke of weapons that could split mountains and armor that could turn aside the gods themselves. I thought they were just tales meant to inspire young warriors. He met her gaze steadily. But evil men pursuing legends often create realities worse than any myth. The implications hung between them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Bloodfang would not simply disappear into the northern wastes. He would continue his bloody search, village by village, until the entire region ran red with innocent blood. And when he was finished with the smaller settlements, his attention would inevitably turn to larger prizes, like Vintergard. Thora seemed to follow his thoughts, for she spoke his fear aloud. He will come here next, won't he? When he learns that someone from Shadowbeak escaped, when he realizes that survivors might carry word of his crimes to others who could oppose him. Brandr nodded grimly. A man like Bloodfang cannot afford to leave witnesses to his failures. He will come, if not for you, then because Vintergard represents the kind of target he cannot resist. Wealthy, established, with enough plunder to outfit his fleet for years of raiding. But even as he acknowledged the threat, Brandr felt something stirring in his chest that he had not experienced in 3 long years. It was purpose, clean and sharp as a newly forged blade. For so long he had existed without direction, his strength meaningless when divorced from those who needed protection. Now, with Thora's survival story burning in his mind and the shadow of Bloodfang's evil stretching toward his former home, he finally understood why the fates had brought them together on this sacred night. The gods, it seemed, were offering him a chance at redemption. The question was whether he possessed the courage to seize it, and whether the village that had cast him out would accept his help when the wolves finally came howling at their gates. The morning sun climbed higher over Vintergard as Brandr made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. Rising from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man setting aside years of careful isolation, he walked to the wooden chest that held his most precious possessions. From within its iron-bound depths, he withdrew an object wrapped in oiled leather, a horn carved from the tusk of a massive walrus, its surface etched with intricate knotwork that seemed to writhe in the firelight. "This is the horn of assembly," he explained to Thora, who watched him with growing understanding. "It has not been blown for 3 winters, not since my exile began. But the threat you describe leaves me no choice." Thora struggled to sit up straighter, alarm clear in her sea-green eyes. "You mean to warn them? The village that cast you out?" "I mean to protect them," Brandr replied simply. "Whatever wrongs exist between Vintergard and myself, they pale beside the evil that approaches. Bloodfang spares no one, not the warriors who might oppose him, not the children who cannot fight back, not the elders who remember better days. If I say nothing and he comes, their blood will be on my hands, as surely as if I had wielded the blade myself." He moved to the door, horn in hand, then paused. "But I will not force this burden upon you. You have suffered enough, and you owe these people nothing. There is a hunter's shelter, a day's ride to the east, well-stocked and hidden. You could wait there until the danger passes." "No." The word came from Thora with surprising firmness. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly but standing on her own strength. "Bloodfang murdered my family, burned my home, destroyed everything I ever loved. If there is a chance to stop him from doing the same to others, then I stand with you." Brandr studied her face, seeing there the kind of determination that marked true warriors. Not those who fought for glory or gold, but those who fought because someone had to stand against the darkness. "Very well, but know that the path ahead will be harder than anything you have yet endured." He stepped outside into the crisp morning air and raised the horn to his lips. The sound that emerged was deep and resonant, rolling across the snow-covered landscape like the voice of the mountain itself. It was a call that had not been heard in 3 years, and its meaning was unmistakable to any who knew the old ways. Danger approaches, and all who would defend their homes must gather. From the village below, Brandr could see tiny figures emerging from longhouses, heads turning toward his distant dwelling as the horn's call echoed off the surrounding hills. He blew it twice more, following the ancient pattern that signified urgent assembly, then lowered the instrument and waited. They came within the hour, not all of them, for some would rather face death than seek help from the exiled berserker. But enough. Jarl Gunnar the Wise led the group, his grey beard and weathered face marking him as a man who had seen many winters and survived many battles. Behind him walked Thorstein the Bold, captain of the village guard, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Others followed. Bjorn the blacksmith, with arms like tree trunks from working the forge, Astrid the healer, whose knowledge of herbs and wounds made her invaluable in times of crisis, and a handful of seasoned warriors whose loyalty to the village outweighed their fear of its most infamous exile. Brandr Ironwill, Jarl Gunnar said as he approached, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a leader walking between competing loyalties. 3 years you have kept to yourself, honoring the terms of your exile. Why do you call us now? Because death comes to Vintergard on black sails, Brandr replied, gesturing toward Thora, who had wrapped herself in his winter cloak and emerged to stand beside him. This is Thora Ravensmark, sole survivor of the Shadowbeak settlement. She brings word of Bloodfang the Cruel and his fleet. The reaction was immediate. Several warriors stepped back involuntarily, hands moving to weapons in reflexive response to that dreaded name. Astrid the healer gasped audibly, while Thorstein's face went pale beneath his battle-scarred features. Bloodfang, Jarl Gunnar repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. I had hoped never to hear that name spoken in our lands. Tell us what you witnessed, child. Thora straightened her shoulders and recounted her story with the same devastating clarity she had shown Brandr earlier. She spoke of the black ships and red sails, of her family's slaughter, of Bloodfang's obsession with the mythical frostborn blade. As her tale unfolded, the faces of her listeners grew increasingly grim. 5 ships, Thorstein muttered when she finished. 150 raiders, maybe more. We have perhaps 60 warriors in fighting condition. Numbers alone will not determine this battle, Brandr said. Bloodfang's men are seasoned killers, but they are also raiders who expect easy victories and quick plunder. If we can deny them both, we might find ways to even the odds. Bjorn the blacksmith spat into the snow. And why should we trust the counsel of an exile, the man who lost himself so completely in bloodlust that his own kinsmen feared him? The words hung in the cold air like a challenge, and Brandr felt the familiar stirring of the rage that had once defined him. But 3 years of solitude had taught him the difference between feeling anger and acting upon it. Instead of reaching for his weapon, he spoke with quiet dignity. You should not trust me because of who I was, but because of who I have become. I offer no excuses for my past failures, no pleas for forgiveness I have not earned. But Thora's survival has given me a chance to stand between innocents and those who would harm them. I will not waste that opportunity. Jarl Gunnar studied Brandr with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to reading the hearts of warriors. What he saw there, the absence of the wild fury that had once burned so brightly, replaced by something steadier and more purposeful, seemed to satisfy him. What do you propose? The Jarl asked. First, we must assume Bloodfang will come within days, not weeks. Word of Thora's escape will reach him soon, and he cannot afford to leave survivors who might rally opposition against him. Second, we cannot meet him in open battle. His numbers and experience give him too great an advantage. We must use Vintergard's geography and our knowledge of the land to create opportunities. Astrid stepped forward, her healer's instincts extending beyond wounds to the broader health of the community. What of the non-combatants, the children, the elders, those who cannot fight? Hidden, Brandr replied immediately. There are caves in the high peaks that could shelter them, hunting lodges in the deep forest that raiders would never find. But that raises another question. Who will guide them to safety while the rest of us prepare our defenses? The discussion that followed was tense but productive. Plans began to take shape. Evacuation routes for the vulnerable, defensive positions that could channel attacking forces into kill zones, supply caches that could sustain a prolonged resistance. But through it all, Brandr could sense the underlying current of doubt that ran beneath their cooperation. They were working with him because necessity left them no choice, not because they had forgiven his past or fully trusted his transformation. It was a fragile alliance built on shared danger rather than mutual respect, and he knew it could shatter at the first sign of his old nature reasserting itself. As the group prepared to return to the village and begin their preparations, Jarl Gunnar lingered behind. "Brandr," he said quietly, "I pray to all the gods that the man we banished 3 years ago is truly dead, because if he returns when the blood begins to flow, he will doom us all." "Then pray also," Brandr replied, "that the man who stands before you now is strong enough to keep him buried." The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation that transformed the peaceful village of Vintergard into something resembling a military camp. Brandr found himself in the strange position of being both outsider and essential advisor, his tactical knowledge desperately needed, even as his presence made many villagers uncomfortable. He moved through the settlement like a ghost of its past, offering guidance where it was welcomed and keeping to the shadows when it was not. Working alongside Thorstein, he identified the best defensive positions using the natural geography of the fjord. The village sat in a natural amphitheater, carved by ancient glaciers, with steep cliffs on 3 sides and only one viable approach from the sea. By felling trees and positioning them strategically, they could create choke points that would force attacking raiders into predictable patterns. "Here," Brandr said, pointing to a narrow passage between 2 large boulders that marked the main path from the shore. "If we can funnel them through this gap, archers positioned on the heights could devastate their ranks before they reach the village proper." Thorstein nodded grudgingly, his military mind recognizing sound strategy even when it came from a source he mistrusted. "And if they try to scale the cliffs directly?" "Loose rocks, ready to roll. A few well-placed boulders can turn climbing routes into death traps." Brandr traced lines on the rough map they had sketched in the dirt. "But we must be prepared for the possibility that some will make it through. That means fallback positions, predetermined rally points, and clear chains of command." While the men worked on fortifications, Thora had thrown herself into organizing the evacuation of the village's most vulnerable residents. Despite her recent trauma, or perhaps because of it, she moved through the longhouses with fierce determination, convincing reluctant families to gather their most precious possessions and prepare for a journey to hidden shelters in the mountains. Brandr watched her from a distance as she knelt beside a young mother whose infant had been crying inconsolably since the preparations began. With infinite patience, Thora showed the woman how to wrap the child in furs that would muffle sound, how to pack milk and provisions that would last several days, how to keep hope alive even when everything familiar was being left behind. "She has strength," observed Astrid the healer, joining Brandr on his observation. "The kind that comes not from never being broken, but from learning how to rebuild after destruction." "The gods tested her with fire," Brandr replied quietly. "But steel only becomes truly strong when it is forged in flames." Astrid studied his profile as he watched Thora comfort another family. "And what of your own testing? Have the gods finished their work with you?" It was a question that cut deeper than any sword thrust. Brandr was quiet for a long moment, weighing honesty against the easier path of deflection. I thought my trials were punishment for past failures. Now I wonder if they were preparation for this moment. The berserker's rage. Do you feel it still? When battle comes, will you be able to control what once controlled you? I feel it, Brandr admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Like a wolf in a cage, pacing and hungry. But I have learned to be the master of that cage. The question is whether my strength will hold when the killing begins. That evening, as the village settled into an uneasy rest, punctuated by the sounds of ongoing fortification work, Brandr found himself drawn to the small shrine that stood at Vintergard's heart. It was a simple structure of stone and wood dedicated to Thor the Protector and Frigg the Mother, where villagers had come for generations to seek blessing for their endeavors and protection for their families. He had not entered the shrine since before his exile, unwilling to pollute sacred ground with his presence. But tonight, with battle approaching and the weight of so many lives resting on his shoulders, he felt compelled to try once more to commune with the gods who had shaped his fate. Inside, he found Thora kneeling before the altar, her broken pendant clutched in her hands. She looked up as he entered, tears glistening on her cheeks in the candlelight. "I was praying for my family," she said softly, asking the gods to guide their spirits home, to let them know their deaths were not meaningless if they lead to justice for others. Brandr knelt beside her, his massive frame somehow fitting naturally into the sacred space. "They watch over you still. I have seen how you carry their love in everything you do, how you comfort the frightened, how you give hope to the hopeless. That is their legacy living on." "And what legacy will you leave?" Thora asked, turning to study his face in the flickering light. "If tomorrow brings death, what will people remember of Brandr Ironwill?" It was a question that had haunted his exile, the fear that history would record only his failures and forget whatever good he had once done. But looking at Thora now, seeing the trust in her eyes despite everything she knew about his past, he found an answer that surprised him with its simplicity. "I hope they will remember that a man can change, that no matter how far someone falls into darkness, they can still choose to stand in defense of the light." She reached out then, her small hand covering his scarred one. "Whatever happens when Bloodfang comes, know that you have already given me something I thought was lost forever. Hope. For that alone, your name deserves to be spoken with honor." They prayed together in the silence that followed, two broken souls seeking strength from whatever god still listened to the wounded. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow and the distant sound of men sharpening weapons, preparing for a battle that would test not only their martial skills, but the very soul of their community. When they finally emerged from the shrine, they found Thorstein waiting for them with news that turned the blood cold in their veins. "Smoke on the horizon," he reported grimly, "coming from the direction of Elkshaw settlement, and our scouts report black sails have been spotted in the outer fjords." Brandr felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. How long? Half a day, perhaps less if the wind favors them. The moment of final preparation had arrived. Across the village, warning bells began to toll, calling every able-bodied defender to their assigned positions. Families embraced what might be final goodbyes, as children and elders began their journey to hidden sanctuaries in the mountains. Weapons were distributed, prayers were whispered, and the ancient ritual of preparing for battle began to unfold with practiced efficiency. But in the heart of it all stood Brandr Ironwill, no longer an exile, but not yet fully accepted, carrying within himself both the potential for salvation and the seeds of destruction. The test that would define his true nature was finally at hand, and the outcome would determine not only his own fate, but the survival of everyone he had sworn to protect. Tomorrow would bring Bloodfang the Cruel to Vintergard's shores. Tonight was for final preparations, last words, and the kind of peace that only comes before the storm. The black ships appeared at dawn like omens of doom against the grey winter sky. 5 vessels with blood-red sails crept through the morning mist, their dragon-headed prows cutting the dark water with predatory grace. From his position on the cliffs overlooking the fjord, Brandr counted the silhouettes of armed men crowding each deck, warriors whose reputation for cruelty had spread like wildfire across the northern lands. At the lead ship's bow stood a figure that made even seasoned fighters step back instinctively. Bloodfang the Cruel was exactly as Thora had described him, a giant among giants, draped in the white pelt of some massive Arctic bear, his dark mail gleaming like the scales of a serpent. Even at this distance, there was something about his presence that seemed to corrupt the very air around him, as if violence and malice had taken physical form. "Thor's hammer," whispered young Eric, one of Vintergard's newest warriors, his voice shaking despite his efforts to appear brave. "Look at the size of him." "Size means nothing in battle," Brandr replied calmly, though his own eyes never left the approaching fleet. "I have seen large men fall to smaller opponents who fought with better strategy. Fear him for his cunning and his cruelty, not his stature." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, Brandr felt the familiar stirring in his chest, the berserker's rage beginning to wake from its long slumber. The sight of the man who had murdered Thora's family, who had burned innocents for sport, who now came to visit or similar horrors upon Vintergard, kindled a fury that 3 years of exile had not entirely extinguished. From her position behind a carefully constructed barricade, Thora watched, the ships with eyes that burned with suppressed emotion. In her hands, she clutched a war spear that Bjorn the blacksmith had crafted especially for her, its iron point gleaming with fresh oil, its ash shaft carved with protective runes. She had never killed a man before the destruction of her village, but the ordeal had awakened something primal within her, a need for justice that bordered on vengeance. "When the time comes," she had told Brandr the night before, "I want to face him, Bloodfang. I want him to know that the Shadowbeak clan did not die in vain." Brandr had tried to dissuade her, pointing out that she lacked the training and experience for such a confrontation, but there had been something in her eyes, a depth of determination that reminded him of his own mother's fierce protectiveness, that told him arguments would be useless. Thora would have her reckoning, one way or another. The lead ship ground against the rocky shore with a sound like breaking bones. A gangplank crashed down, and the first wave of raiders poured onto the beach with bloodthirsty roars that echoed off the surrounding cliffs. They were a motley collection of the northern land's worst outcasts, men who had been banished from their own clans for crimes too terrible to forgive, warriors who served gold and violence with equal devotion, killers who had forgotten whatever honor they might once have possessed. But it was their leader who commanded attention. Bloodfang strode down the gangplank with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat, his massive war axe slung across his back like the promise of death itself. Behind him came his inner circle, scarred veterans whose loyalty had been bought with shared atrocities and the promise of endless plunder. "People of Vintergard," Bloodfang's voice boomed across the water, carrying easily to the defenders hidden among the cliffs and fortifications. "I am Bloodfang the Cruel, and I come seeking answers to questions that your neighbors could not provide. Give me what I seek, and your deaths will be swift. Resist me, and I will make your suffering legendary." From his position behind a boulder that provided both cover and a clear view of the beach, Thorstein called back the village's formal response. Vintergard recognizes no authority, but that of our Jarl and our gods. State your business, or depart our lands in peace. Bloodfang's laughter was like the sound of ice cracking under pressure. Peace? Child, I am the storm that devours peace. I am the winter that kills hope. I seek the frost-born blade, and I will tear apart every settlement from here to the edge of the world until I find it. There is no such weapon here, Jarl Gunnar replied, emerging from behind the fortifications with the dignity befitting his station. His white hair and weathered face marked him as a man of wisdom, but his hand rested confidently on his sword hilt. We are farmers and fishermen, not keepers of ancient artifacts. That is what they said at Shadowbeak, Bloodfang replied, pulling something from beneath his bare pelt cloak. Even from a distance, the defenders could see it was a severed head, grey-bearded and bearing the scars of a life spent on the sea. This is what remains of Jarl Eriksson after he gave me the same answer. Thora's gasp of anguish was audible even over the wind, and Brandr felt her pain as if it were his own. The sight of her father's head, displayed like a trophy, ignited something dangerous within him, something he had worked for 3 years to keep buried. The berserker's rage stirred more strongly, promising him the sweet release of mindless violence, the intoxicating freedom of casting aside all restraint. "You feel it, don't you?" said a voice beside him. Brandr turned to find Astrid the healer crouched nearby, her wise eyes studying his face with professional concern. The old fury, awakening at the sight of evil that demands justice. "I feel it," Brandr admitted, his knuckles white as he gripped his own weapon. "But feeling and acting are different things. I will not become the monster again, no matter the provocation." "Perhaps," Astrid said thoughtfully, "the monster was never the problem. Perhaps the problem was letting the monster control you, instead of learning to control it." Before Brandr could respond to this unexpected wisdom, Bloodfang raised his axe and gave the signal his men had been waiting for. With a chorus of savage war cries, the first wave of raiders charged up the beach toward the defenders' positions, their weapons glittering in the pale morning light like the teeth of hungry wolves. The Battle of Vintergard had begun, and with it came the ultimate test of whether Brandr Ironwill could find a way to channel his rage without being consumed by it. In the chaos that followed, with arrows singing through the air and the crash of shield against sword echoing off the cliffs, both the hero and the monster within him would be tested as never before. The time for preparation was over. Now came the reckoning. The first assault broke against Vintergard's defenses, like waves against stone, but Brandr knew it was merely a test of their resolve. From his vantage point among the fortifications, he watched as Bloodfang's raiders probed for weaknesses, testing the archer's range and the defender's coordination. These were not the desperate attacks of desperate men, but the calculated movements of predators learning their prey's patterns. "They're holding back their best fighters," Thorstein observed, crouched beside a wooden barrier that bristled with spear points. "These are just thralls and green recruits, meant to tire us out and reveal our positions." Brandr nodded grimly. Bloodfang didn't earn his reputation through reckless charges. He's studying us, learning how we fight, waiting for us to show him our true strength so he can plan accordingly. The pattern continued through the morning. Wave after wave of raiders threw themselves against the defensive positions, each assault slightly different from the last. Some focused on the narrow pass between the boulders, others attempted to scale the cliff faces, still others tried to flank around the village's edges. Each time the defenders drove them back, but the cost grew with every repelled attack. Young Eric took an arrow through the shoulder during the third assault, crying out in pain as Astrid dragged him to safety behind the barricades. Old Magnus the Fletcher collapsed from exhaustion after shooting arrow after arrow into the advancing raiders, his hands shaking too badly to draw his bow. One by one, Vintergard's defenders were being worn down by the relentless pressure, and Bloodfang hadn't even committed his veteran warriors to the fight. "We cannot continue like this," Jarl Gunnar said, during a brief lull between attacks. "My men are brave, but they are farmers and fishermen, not professional soldiers. Bloodfang's strategy is working. He's bleeding us dry without risking his best troops." From her position near the medical supplies, Thora watched the proceedings with growing anguish. She had acquitted herself well in the fighting, her spear finding its mark more than once among the raiders who had tried to breach the defences. But seeing her new allies suffer and die while their tormentor remained safely out of reach was agony worse than any physical wound. "There has to be something we can do," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Some way to force him into a real confrontation instead of this slow torture." Brandr had been thinking the same thing, but the tactical considerations were complex. To draw Bloodfang into committing his full strength, they would need to present a target too tempting to ignore, something that would make the raider chief abandon his cautious strategy in favor of a decisive strike. It was then that an idea began to form, terrible in its simplicity and dangerous beyond measure. "What if we gave him what he wants?" Brandr said slowly, his mind working through the implications even as he spoke. "You mean surrender?" Thorstein asked, horrified. "No," Brandr replied, his voice growing stronger as the plan crystallized. "I mean, we give him the Frostborn blade." The suggestion sent a ripple of confusion through the gathered defenders. Astrid the healer spoke first, her voice carrying the skeptical tone of someone accustomed to sorting truth from fiction. "The blade is a legend, Brandr. A story told around winter fires to frighten children and inspire warriors. How can we give him something that doesn't exist?" "Can't we?" Brandr asked, pulling his own war axe from where it hung at his belt. The weapon was magnificent, its blade forged from the finest steel, its edge sharp enough to split hair, its handle wrapped in leather, stained dark with the blood of countless enemies. Bloodfang has never seen the true Frostborn blade. He knows only the legends, the Yahor descriptions passed down through generations of storytellers. What if we were to create a convincing replica? Understanding dawned slowly across the faces of his listeners. Bjorn the blacksmith was the first to grasp the full implications of the plan. "You want to forge a false blade," the smith said, his eyes lighting with professional interest. "Something that looks ancient and powerful enough to convince a man who has searched for it across half the known world." "Exactly. But more than that, I want to make sure I am the one who delivers it to him." The objections came immediately and from all directions. The plan was too dangerous, too likely to fail, too dependent on factors beyond their control. But as Brandr outlined his thinking, the desperate logic became clear. "Bloodfang will not be satisfied with simply receiving the blade," he explained. "A man like that will want to test its power, to see for himself that the legends are true. That moment of testing, when his attention is focused on the weapon instead of his surroundings, that will be our chance." "Our chance for what?" Jarl Gunnar asked, though the tone of his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "To end this," Brandr replied simply, "one way or another." The debate that followed was fierce, but brief. Time was running short, and the alternative, slowly bleeding to death under the raiders' relentless attacks, was unacceptable. Finally, Jarl Gunnar made the decision that would seal all their fates. "Do it," he said. "But know that if this plan fails, If Bloodfang sees through the deception, or if you fall to his blade, Vintergard dies with you. Bjorn the blacksmith worked with desperate speed, transforming Brandr's war axe into something that might pass for an artifact of the elder days. He etched ancient runes along the blade's surface, wrapped the handle in cloth that had been treated with oils to give it an aged appearance, and even managed to create a scabbard that looked as though it had been crafted by the gods themselves. But the true test would come not in its appearance, but in Brandr's ability to sell the deception. He would need to approach Bloodfang under a flag of truce, present himself as a defeated defender, offering terms of surrender, and somehow get close enough to strike before the raider chief realized he had been deceived. "You know this is likely death," Thora said, as Brandr prepared for his desperate gambit. She had found him alone behind the fortifications, checking his equipment one final time before beginning his approach to the enemy lines. "I have been dead for 3 years," Brandr replied, settling the disguised axe across his back. "If this plan succeeds, perhaps I can finally live again. And if it fails, you will have died, trying to save people who cast you out, trying to protect those who feared you." Thora's voice was soft but steady. "There is honor in that, whatever the outcome." Brandr looked into her eyes and saw there not the fear he expected, but something far more precious: faith. She believed in him, believed in the man he had become, despite everything she knew about the monster he had been. "If I do not return," he said, "know that you gave me something I thought was lost forever. You reminded me that redemption is possible, that a man's worst deeds need not define his final chapter." With that, he picked up the white banner that would mark him as approaching under truce and began his walk toward the beach where Bloodfang waited, and where the true test of his transformation would finally begin. The white banner of truce fluttered in the cold wind as Brandr walked down the beach toward Bloodfang's position. Behind him, the defenders of Vintergard watched in tense silence, their hopes and fears hanging on the success of his desperate gambit. Ahead, the raider chief's warriors parted like a sea of steel and leather, their weapons lowered but ready, their eyes following the massive figure approaching their leader. Bloodfang himself stood motionless as Brandr drew near, his bare pelt cloak rippling in the Arctic breeze. This close, the raider chief was even more imposing than distance had suggested. He stood nearly as tall as Brandr himself, his frame bulging with muscle earned through years of constant warfare. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as dangerous, pale as winter ice, utterly devoid of warmth or mercy, studying Brandr with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. "So," Bloodfang said when Brandr stopped just outside sword range, "Vintergard sends its exile to treat with me. How fitting that outcasts should deal with outcasts." "I come under flag of truce," Brandr replied, his voice steady despite the proximity of so much concentrated evil. "My people are prepared to discuss terms." "Terms?" Bloodfang's laughter was like the sound of grinding stone. "What terms could peasants and fishermen offer to me? Your village is already mine. I simply choose when to claim it." "We have something you want," Brandr said, slowly reaching for the disguised weapon strapped across his back. "Something you have sought across half the northern lands, leaving a trail of blood and ash in your wake." Bloodfang's eyes narrowed, his attention sharpening like a blade being honed. "Show me." With deliberate movements, Brandr drew forth the false Frostborn blade. Bjorn's craftsmanship had been masterful. The weapon looked ancient beyond measure, its runes seeming to pulse with their own inner light in the grey morning. Even the raiders standing nearby stepped back involuntarily, awed by what they perceived as the presence of genuine magic. Impossible, Bloodfang breathed, but his eyes blazed with hunger as he stared at the blade. The Frostborn weapon, here, in this forgotten corner of the world. Hidden by my ancestors, Brandr lied smoothly. Passed down through generations with instructions to reveal it, only when our people faced extinction. That time has come. Bloodfang took a step closer, his massive hands reaching out as if to touch the weapon, then stopping just short of contact. You would trade this, the most powerful artifact in the known world, for your miserable village? Power means nothing to farmers and fishermen, Brandr replied. We cannot eat legends or shelter our children with ancient magic. Take your prize and leave our people in peace. For a long moment, Bloodfang studied the blade with the intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts. His weathered fingers traced the air just above its surface, and Brandr held his breath, waiting for the moment when greed would overcome caution and bring the raider chief within striking distance. It was then that everything went wrong. You know, Bloodfang said conversationally, his gaze never leaving the weapon, I have spent 5 years searching for this blade, following every legend, pursuing every rumor, torturing every scholar and storyteller who claimed knowledge of its whereabouts. In all that time, I learned many things about the Frostborn weapon. Brandr felt ice forming in his stomach, but he kept his expression neutral. Such as the fact, Bloodfang continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that the true Frostborn blade was destroyed over a century ago by King Harold the Wise, who feared its power would corrupt whoever wielded it. The revelation hit Brandr like a physical blow. All this time, all this suffering and slaughter had been in pursuit of a weapon that no longer existed. Bloodfang was not searching for the blade itself. He was hunting for something else, entirely. You see, the raider chief said, finally looking up from the false weapon to meet Brandr's eyes. The blade may be gone, but the knowledge used to forge it remains, hidden in the memory of the last smith who worked on it before its destruction, passed down through his bloodline to those who carry his gift. Understanding dawned like the breaking of a terrible storm. You're not looking for the Frostborn blade. You're looking for someone who can forge a new one. Very good, exile. Bloodfang's smile was like the grin of a skull. The blood of Grimjaw the Forge Master runs thin in these northern lands, but it still flows in certain families. The Shadowbeak clan, for instance, claimed descent from his line. Which is why you destroyed them, Brandr said, the pieces of the horrific puzzle finally coming together. You thought one of them could create what you sought. Indeed. But they proved disappointingly mortal when put to the test. However, their bloodline records spoke of marriages with other clans, other families who might carry the gift. Bloodfang gestured toward the village behind Brandr, including certain residents of Vintergard. The raider chief's next words turned Brandr's blood to ice. Tell me, exile, what do you know of the ancestry of the Maiden you harbor, the one who escaped my justice at Shadowbeak? Brandr's mind raced. Thora had never mentioned any special heritage, any connection to the legendary smiths of old. But then he remembered her pendant, the intricate raven design that had seemed almost lifelike in its detail, and her mentions of family traditions passed down through generations. You can see the understanding in his eyes, Bloodfang said to his lieutenants, though his gaze never left Brandr's face. The girl carries more than just the blood of fishermen. She carries the genetic memory of how to forge weapons that could reshape the world itself. Even if that were true, Brandr said, his hand tightening on the false blade's handle, she would never help you. Not after what you did to her family." "Oh, but she will," Bloodfang replied with absolute confidence. "Because I am going to offer her something she cannot refuse, the chance to save every person in this village from the fate that befell her own. All she has to do is forge me one simple blade, and I will sail away from these shores forever, leaving Vintergard and its people untouched." The trap was now fully revealed in all its cruel perfection. Bloodfang had never intended to simply take the village by force. He had orchestrated this entire confrontation to flush out Thora, to force her into a position where she would have to choose between her desire for vengeance and her compassion for innocence. And knowing what Brandr knew of her character, there was only one choice she would make. "You're a monster," Brandr said, his voice thick with rage and despair. "I am pragmatic," Bloodfang corrected. "Violence is simply a tool, like any other. The threat of it is often more effective than its application. Why waste good raiders conquering a village when I can accomplish my goals through intelligent negotiation? And if she refuses? If she chooses death over compliance?" Bloodfang's smile widened, showing teeth filed to points in the manner of certain savage tribes. "Then I will kill every man, woman, and child in Vintergard, slowly and creatively, making sure she watches every moment of their suffering before I finally grant her the mercy of joining them. The choice, as they say, is entirely hers." With horrifying clarity, Brandr realized that his plan had not just failed. It had played directly into Bloodfang's hands. The raider chief had known all along that Vintergard would never surrender easily, had counted on them attempting some desperate stratagem that would reveal their true capabilities and resources. Now he held all the advantages, with Thora's ancestry giving him leverage that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. But there was one thing Bloodfang had not counted on, one variable in his careful calculations that he could not have anticipated. He had underestimated the depth of connection that had formed between the exiled berserker and the surviving maiden, and the lengths to which a man, seeking redemption, would go to protect someone who had given him hope. As Bloodfang gestured for his warriors to escort Brandr back to the village with his new terms, the rage that had been building in the exile's chest finally broke free of its carefully constructed restraints. But this was not the mindless fury of his past. This was something far more dangerous. This was the controlled wrath of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The real battle was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with weapons, but with the very soul of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed determined to reward only monsters. The silence that followed Brandr's return to the village was more deafening than any war cry. As he stood before the assembled defenders and revealed Bloodfang's true purpose, the faces around him transformed from hope to despair, to grim determination. The weight of impossible choice settled over Vintergard like a funeral shroud, and every person present understood that their world had fundamentally changed. Thora herself stood frozen, her sea-green eyes wide with shock as the implications crashed over her like an Arctic wave. "My grandmother never spoke of any such heritage," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "She said the ravens on our pendant were symbols of wisdom and protection. Nothing more." "Family secrets often die with those who carry them," Astrid the healer observed gently, "especially when that knowledge is dangerous. Your grandmother may have been protecting you from exactly this kind of situation." "But I don't know how to forge weapons," Thora protested, her hands shaking as she stared down at them as if they belonged to someone else. "I can barely manage to sharpen a knife properly. How could I possibly create something as complex as the Frostborn blade?" Jarl Gunnar stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of leadership. Perhaps the knowledge is not conscious, but instinctual. The old stories speak of bloodline memories that emerge only when the need is greatest, skills that awaken in times of crisis. Brandr watched Thora struggle with this revelation and felt his heart breaking for her. She had already lost everything once, her family, her home, her entire world. Now she was being asked to choose between her principles and the lives of people who had shown her kindness. It was a burden no one should have to bear, especially someone who had already suffered so much. "There has to be another way," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. "Some strategy we haven't considered, some weakness in Bloodfang's position we could exploit." Thorstein shook his head grimly. "He has us completely outmaneuvered. His ships block any escape by sea. His numbers make victory in open battle impossible. And now he holds leverage that neutralizes our defensive advantages. Unless we can somehow turn his own forces against him." "Actually," said a voice from behind them, "that may be exactly what we need to do." Everyone turned to see Bjorn the blacksmith emerging from behind a pile of weapons and armor, his massive frame moving with purpose. In his hands, he carried something that made several of the defenders step back in alarm. A blade that seemed to drink in the morning light, its surface dark as midnight, but somehow still gleaming with malevolent energy. "What is that?" Jarl Gunnar demanded. "The real Frostborn blade," Bjorn replied quietly. "Or as close to it as makes no difference." The revelation sent another shock through the assembled group. Thora gasped audibly, while Brandr felt his tactical mind racing to process this new development. "That's impossible," Astrid said. "You told us yourself that you were creating a false blade to deceive Bloodfang." "I told you I was transforming Brandr's axe into something that might pass for the legendary weapon," Bjorn corrected. "I never said I couldn't also create the genuine article." He held up the dark blade, turning it so that its surface caught what little light filtered through the grey clouds. "My own family carries blood from Grimjaw's line, though more diluted than what flows in Thora's veins. I have been working on this in secret for years, driven by dreams and visions I didn't fully understand until now. The weapon was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Unlike the disguised axe that Brandr had carried to Bloodfang, this blade radiated an aura of genuine power that made the air around it feel colder. Frost actually formed along its edges as they watched, and when Bjorn moved it through the air, the sound it made was like the whisper of winter wind through dead trees. "The knowledge came to me gradually," Bjorn continued, his voice taking on an almost trance-like quality. "In my dreams, I saw the forging techniques, the materials needed, the runes that must be carved into the metal while it was still hot from the fire. I thought I was going mad, but the visions were so clear, so detailed, that I had to try." Thora stepped closer to examine the weapon, and as she did, something extraordinary happened. The blade's dark surface began to pulse with a subtle inner light, responding to her presence like iron filings drawn to a lodestone. The effect was undeniable. There was a connection between the weapon and the young woman that went beyond mere proximity. "It recognizes you," Brandr said, understanding flooding through him. "The blade knows its maker's bloodline." "But what good does this do us?" Thorstein asked pragmatically. "We still cannot defeat Bloodfang's forces in open battle, and giving him the real weapon would only make him infinitely more dangerous." It was Thora who provided the answer, her voice growing stronger as a plan began to form in her mind. "What if we don't give it to him? What if we let him take it?" "I don't understand the difference," Jarl Gunnar said. "Bloodfang expects me to forge the blade under duress, to create it specifically for him while he watches and directs the process. But this weapon already exists, and it carries something his version never would: the legitimate claim of its true creator's bloodline. Thora's eyes were beginning to shine with desperate hope. The legends speak of the Frostborn blade as choosing its wielder, of being as dangerous to those unworthy to carry it as it was to their enemies. Brandr felt his pulse quicken as he grasped the implications. "You're suggesting we let him steal a weapon that will turn against him?" "I'm suggesting we give the blade exactly what it was created for: the chance to judge whether its bearer is worthy of its power." Thora reached out tentatively to touch the weapon's surface, and when her fingers made contact, the entire blade flared with cold fire that illuminated the dawn gloom. According to the stories my grandmother told, the original Frostborn blade destroyed 3 would-be kings who tried to claim it through treachery and violence. The plan that emerged from their desperate brainstorming was as audacious as it was dangerous. They would appear to capitulate to Bloodfang's demands, allowing him to believe that Thora was forging the weapon under his direction. But instead of creating a new blade, she would use her inherited knowledge to awaken the power sleeping within Bjorn's creation, turning it into a weapon that would judge the worthiness of whoever tried to wield it. "The risk is enormous," Astrid warned. "If the blade doesn't react as the legends suggest, if Bloodfang proves worthy in its estimation, then we will have handed him the power to conquer the entire northern world. And if we do nothing," Brandr countered, "innocent people will die while evil triumphs unopposed. Sometimes the greatest courage lies in taking the greatest risks." As they refined their strategy, each person took on specific roles. Bjorn would continue to work openly on what appeared to be weapon repairs, giving him cover for the subtle modifications needed to prepare the true Frostborn blade. Thorstein would position the remaining defenders to take advantage of whatever chaos might ensue when the weapon's power was unleashed. Astrid would ensure that the non-combatants were fully evacuated and hidden, removing them from danger, regardless of what happened in the village itself. But the greatest burden fell on Thora, who would need to convince Bloodfang that she was reluctantly cooperating while actually preparing for a confrontation that could determine the fate of everyone she had come to care about. The acting required would test her emotional strength as much as any physical trial, forcing her to appear broken and defeated, while actually orchestrating their only hope of victory. "There's something else," Brandr said, as they prepared to put their plan into motion. "Bloodfang will not come alone when he claims the blade. He'll bring his most trusted warriors, the ones whose loyalty is absolute. Even if the weapon turns against him, we'll still face a dozen of the most dangerous fighters in the northern seas. Then we'll need our own champion ready to face them," Jarl Gunnar replied, his gaze settling meaningfully on Brandr. "Someone whose skill in battle is legendary, whose reputation strikes fear into the hearts of even hardened raiders." Brandr felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. But this time it was different. This time he would fight not for glory or gold, but for people who had given him a second chance at redemption. The berserker's rage still stirred within him, but now it was tempered by purpose, controlled by will, channeled toward protection rather than destruction. "I will be ready," he promised, and in those simple words lay all the hope and determination of a man who had finally found his true calling. As the morning sun climbed higher in the grey sky, the final preparations began. Weapons were sharpened, prayers were whispered, and the ancient ritual of preparing for battle unfolded with desperate intensity. But beneath it all lay the knowledge that this would not be a conventional fight, decided by strength of arms or tactical superiority. This would be a contest between the power of ancient magic and the corruption of modern evil, with the souls of everyone in Vintergard hanging in the balance. And at its center stood 3 unlikely champions: an exiled berserker seeking redemption, a surviving maiden carrying the weight of ancestral knowledge, and a blacksmith whose dreams had become reality in ways none of them could have imagined. The climax was approaching, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether good could triumph when faced with the darkest expressions of human evil. The meeting took place at noon in the village's central square, with Bloodfang and his most trusted warriors arranged in a loose semicircle around the makeshift forge that Bjorn had constructed for the deception. The raider chief had brought exactly what Brandr had predicted: a dozen of his most dangerous lieutenants, men whose scars and bearing marked them as survivors of countless battles and architects of untold horrors. Thora knelt beside the forge, her hands moving with surprising confidence over tools she had never used before. The ancestral memories were awakening within her, generation upon generation of smithing knowledge flooding through her consciousness like water breaking through a dam. She could feel the presence of her forebears guiding her movements, her great-grandmother's steady hand, her ancestors' understanding of metal and fire, the collective wisdom of the Forge Master's bloodline flowing through her veins. "Fascinating," Bloodfang murmured, watching her work with the intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts. "I can see the knowledge awakening in her. Look at the way her hands move now, compared to when she first approached the anvil. The blood remembers what the mind has forgotten." The true Frostborn blade lay hidden beneath layers of soot and false metal, disguised to look like a work in progress. To casual observation, it appeared that Thora was slowly crafting the legendary weapon from raw materials, when in reality, she was carefully removing the concealment that masked its already completed form. Brandr stood at the edge of the square, every muscle tense with readiness, his own weapons within easy reach but not obviously threatening. Around him, the other defenders maintained their positions with the studied casualness of men trying not to appear threatening while remaining ready for immediate action. The slightest mistake, the smallest tell that might alert Bloodfang to their true intentions, could turn their desperate gambit into a massacre. "How much longer?" Bloodfang demanded, his patience wearing thin despite his fascination with the process. "The final stages cannot be rushed," Thora replied, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was attempting. "The runes must be carved precisely, the tempering performed at exactly the right temperature. One mistake could destroy everything." As she spoke, her hands moved in patterns that seemed to dance with their own life. The ancestral knowledge was stronger now, flooding through her with such intensity that she almost felt like a passenger in her own body. She could sense the presence of Grimjaw the Forge Master himself, his spirit somehow awakened by proximity to the weapon he had helped create in the early days of the world. The blade began to respond to her ministrations, its dark surface taking on an inner glow that made the air around it shimmer with cold. Frost formed on the anvil, despite the heat from the forge, and several of Bloodfang's warriors stepped back involuntarily as power began to emanate from the emerging weapon. "Yes," Bloodfang breathed, his eyes wide with hunger and awe. "I can feel it, the power of winter itself, contained within steel and sorcery. With this weapon, I could freeze the seas themselves, bring eternal winter to lands that oppose me, command the very forces of nature." But there was something in the blade's awakening that gave even the raider chief pause. The weapon's response was not one of eager service, but of ancient judgment. As its true nature emerged from concealment, It began to pulse with a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat, its inner light flickering with what almost seemed like consciousness. Thora felt the blade's awareness touching her mind, evaluating her intentions, measuring the purity of her purpose. The sensation was overwhelming, like being examined by a force older than human civilization, judged by standards that had been set when the world was young. For a terrifying moment, she wondered if even she would be found worthy to handle such power. But the blade's judgment was swift and clear. It recognized her bloodline, acknowledged her right to wield it, and more importantly, it sensed the righteousness of her cause. The weapon that had been created to stand against tyranny and evil recognized in Thora someone who sought justice rather than dominance, protection rather than conquest. "It is finished," she announced, rising from her position beside the forge. In her hands, the Frostborn blade gleamed with its full terrible beauty, a weapon that seemed to contain winter's heart, whose very presence made the surrounding air crackle with barely contained power. Bloodfang stepped forward eagerly, his massive hands reaching out to claim the prize he had sought for so long. "At last," he whispered, "the power of the ancients, mine to command." But as his fingers closed around the blade's handle, something went terribly wrong. Instead of the surge of power he expected, Bloodfang felt an agonizing cold that seemed to burn through his very soul. The weapon's surface flared with brilliant light, and when he tried to lift it, the blade refused to move, as if it had become anchored to the earth itself. "What is this?" he roared, his voice carrying a note of panic for the first time since his arrival. "Why will it not obey me?" Thora stepped back, her role in the deception complete, her heart hammering with the knowledge that their desperate gambit had reached its crucial moment. "Because," she said quietly, "the Frostborn blade serves only those it deems worthy. And you, Bloodfang the Cruel, are the very evil it was created to destroy." The moment Bloodfang's scream of rage and pain echoed across the village square, everything erupted into chaos. His lieutenants surged forward, some rushing to aid their leader, others turning their weapons on the defenders who had deceived them. But the Frostborn blade was not finished with its judgment. Power exploded outward from the weapon like a wave of Arctic fury. Ice spread across the ground in crystalline patterns, coating everything within a dozen yards in a layer of frost, so thick it seemed like winter had arrived in an instant. Several of Bloodfang's warriors slipped and fell on the suddenly treacherous footing, while others cried out as the supernatural cold bit through their armor and clothing. Bloodfang himself stood frozen at the center of the maelstrom, his hands still locked around the blade's handle despite the agony it caused him. Ice was forming along his arms, creeping up toward his shoulders with relentless determination. The bare pelt that had served as his symbol of power was now stiff with frost, and his breath came in sharp puffs of vapor that crystallized in the frigid air. "I will not be denied," he roared, pouring all his considerable will into forcing the weapon to obey. "I am Bloodfang the Cruel. I have conquered 12 kingdoms, burned 100 villages, killed more men than the plague itself. This blade will serve me." But the Frostborn weapon had heard such boasts before, from other, would-be conquerors who believed that strength alone granted the right to wield ultimate power. Its response was swift and merciless. The cold intensified, and Bloodfang's legs began to freeze solid, rooting him in place like a tree of ice and flesh. It was then that Brandr struck. Moving with the fluid grace of a predator unleashed, he swept across the ice-covered square toward the nearest group of enemy warriors. His war axe, the real one, not the disguised replica, sang through the air with deadly precision. 3 years of exile had not dulled his fighting skills. If anything, The enforced solitude had given him time to refine his technique, to learn the difference between wild fury and controlled violence. The first raider fell before he even realized the attack had begun, Brandr's blade taking him cleanly through the neck. The second managed to raise his shield, but the exile's strength was legendary even among Vikings, and the wooden barrier shattered under the impact of his blow. The third warrior actually landed a glancing hit against Brandr's shoulder, but the exile barely seemed to notice the wound as he continued his devastating assault. Around the square, the other defenders joined the battle with desperate courage. Thorstein led a charge against a group of raiders trying to reach the village's main gate. His sword work showcased the skills that had made him captain of Vintergard's guard. Bjorn the blacksmith wielded a massive war hammer with the same precision he brought to his forge work, each swing calculated to maximum effect against armor and bone alike. But it was the sight of Thora joining the fight that truly turned the tide. In her hands, she carried a spear that gleamed with reflected light from the Frostborn blade's aura, and when she moved, it was with the same ancestral certainty that had guided her work at the forge. The knowledge flowing through her bloodline extended beyond smithing to the use of weapons, and she fought with a skill that seemed impossible for someone who had been a simple villager just days before. "Impossible!" one of Bloodfang's lieutenants gasped as he found himself being driven back by her relentless assault. "She moves like a trained warrior." "The blood remembers more than just forging," Thora replied grimly, her spear finding the gap between his mail shirt and helmet. "It remembers how to fight for justice." At the center of the battle, Bloodfang was still struggling against the Frostborn blade's judgment. The ice had reached his chest now, and his movements were becoming sluggish as the supernatural cold sapped his strength. But even as his body began to fail him, his mind remained sharp with cunning, born of countless battles. "If I cannot wield this power," he snarled through teeth that were beginning to chatter with cold, "then no one shall." With a tremendous effort of will, he began to twist the blade, trying to break it rather than claim it. The weapon's surface flared with alarm as it sensed his intention, but breaking the Frostborn blade would require more than simple strength. It would demand the kind of sacrificial fury that could overwhelm even ancient magic. Brandr saw what Bloodfang was attempting, and felt his blood turn to ice that had nothing to do with the weapon's aura. If the Raider Chief succeeded in destroying the blade, the resulting magical explosion could level half the village and kill everyone within miles. More than that, it would eliminate forever one of the few weapons capable of standing against the kind of evil that Bloodfang represented. Breaking away from his current opponents, Brandr began fighting his way across the chaos-filled square toward the frozen Raider Chief. Ice made footing treacherous, and enemy warriors blocked his path. But nothing would stop him from reaching Bloodfang before the madman could complete his destructive plan. The final confrontation was about to begin, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether redemption could triumph over revenge, whether protection could overcome destruction, and whether one man's quest for forgiveness could save not only his own soul, but the lives of everyone he had sworn to defend. The clash between Brandr and Bloodfang shook the very foundations of the village square. Even frozen by the Frostborn blade's power, the Raider Chief was still a formidable opponent, his desperation lending him strength that defied the supernatural cold claiming his body. Ice cracked and shattered around them as they fought, each blow threatening to complete either Bloodfang's destructive plan or Brandr's desperate intervention. "You cannot stop me, exile!" Bloodfang snarled, his voice distorted by the frost that was slowly claiming his throat. "If I cannot rule with this power, then no one else shall have it either." Brandr said nothing, pouring all his energy into the fight, that would determine the fate of everyone he had come to protect. This was not the wild berserker rage of his youth, but something far more dangerous. Controlled fury directed by clear purpose, strength tempered by wisdom earned through suffering. Every strike was calculated, every movement precise, as he worked to prevent Bloodfang from completing his final apocalyptic act. The turning point came when Thora joined the confrontation, her spear finding the gap between Bloodfang's armor plates, even as Brandr engaged him from the front. The raider chief roared in pain and fury, but the combined assault finally forced him to release his grip on the Frostborn blade's handle. Instantly, the weapon's power shifted. Instead of continuing to freeze its would-be wielder, the blade's consciousness seemed to recognize that its immediate purpose had been served. The ice began to recede, the supernatural cold fading to more manageable levels, and the chaotic battle around them started to wind down as the remaining raiders found themselves outnumbered and outfought by defenders, inspired by their leader's courage. Bloodfang collapsed to his knees, his body weakened by exposure to power that had judged him unworthy. But even in defeat, his eyes burned with malevolent intelligence. "You think this ends anything?" he gasped. "I am not the only one who seeks such power. There are others, darker minds, greater ambitions. The knowledge of what was accomplished here today will spread, and they will come for the girl and her bloodline." "Let them come," Thora said quietly, stepping forward to reclaim the Frostborn blade. As her hands closed around its handle, the weapon seemed to sing with contentment, its surface warming to her touch while remaining cold as winter to all others. "I am no longer the frightened refugee who stumbled into Brandr's protection. I understand now what I carry. Not just the ability to create weapons of power, but the responsibility to ensure they serve justice rather than tyranny." Brandr watched with pride as she held the legendary blade, seeing in her bearing the kind of quiet strength that marked true leaders. She had been tested by fire and emerged as something greater than the sum of her parts, not just a survivor, but a guardian of ancient knowledge and power. "What will you do now?" he asked. Thora looked around at the village that had become her sanctuary, at the people who had risked everything to protect her and defeat the evil that had destroyed her former life. "I will stay, if Vintergard will have me. There is work to be done, not just in forging weapons, but in teaching others how to recognize and resist the kind of corruption that Bloodfang represented. The old knowledge shouldn't be hoarded by a single bloodline, but shared among those who would use it wisely." Jarl Gunnar, bloodied but victorious, approached their small group with the slow gait of a man who had seen too much battle for one day. "Vintergard would be honored to call you one of our own," he said formally. "Both of you," he added, turning to Brandr with an expression that mixed gratitude with something approaching apology. "I am no longer the man you exiled," Brandr replied, understanding the unspoken offer of reconciliation. "But neither am I the man I was before my exile. I have learned the difference between strength and violence, between protection and destruction. If you will have me back, I will serve this community not as a berserker driven by rage, but as a guardian committed to peace. Then let this day mark not just our victory over those who would harm us, but the return of honor to all who fought for it," the Jarl declared. In the days that followed, as Vintergard buried its dead and tended its wounded, the story of the battle began to take shape in the minds of those who had lived through it. It became a tale not just of martial prowess or magical intervention, but of transformation, how broken people could heal, how exiled souls could find redemption, how ancient wisdom could be awakened in service of modern justice. Thora established a forge at the heart of the village, but it was unlike any smithy the northern lands had ever seen. Here, she taught not just the craft of metalworking, but the philosophy behind it, how weapons should serve protection rather than aggression, how power should flow from wisdom rather than strength alone. Students came from distant settlements to learn from the last daughter of the Forge Master's line, and they carried her teachings back to their own communities, like seeds of a better future. Brandr took up residence in a longhouse within the village proper. His exile formally ended, but his lessons learned during those years of solitude never forgotten. He became Vintergard's protector in truth, but also its teacher, showing young warriors how to channel their aggression constructively, how to defend without becoming the thing they fought against. And in the quiet moments between their duties, when the village slept peacefully under star-filled skies, they would sometimes sit together by the fire and remember the longest night of the year when destiny had brought them together. They had both lost so much: families, homes, innocence. But in finding each other, they had discovered something more valuable than anything that had been taken away. They had found hope and the strength to build a future worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible. The Frostborn blade rested in a place of honor above Thora's forge, no longer a weapon of war, but a symbol of justice, proof that even in a world too often ruled by violence and cruelty, there were still those willing to stand for something better. And in the generations that followed, when children asked about the strange blade that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, they were told the story of how love had triumphed over hate, how redemption had conquered revenge, and how two broken souls had found the strength to forge something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. It was a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth living by, and in the end, that may have been the greatest victory of all.